Trapped whale approaches divers in panic, and what they find wrapped around her will leave you breathless. The piercing cry echoed through the depths of the Pacific Ocean, a sound so haunting it made even the most experienced divers pause in their tracks. James Martinez, a veteran marine rescue specialist of 20 years, had never heard anything quite like it. A whale's call that seemed to carry not just distress, but a desperate plea for help. As he exchanged glances with his diving partner, Sarah Chen, through their masks, both knew this routine survey dive had just transformed into something far more critical. The waters off the coast of Monterey Bay had always been a sanctuary for marine life, but today something was terribly wrong. The morning had started normally enough. Crisp autumn air, calm seas, and the usual chatter of excited tourists on whale-watching boats in the distance. James and Sarah had been documenting the seasonal migration of humpback whales, a task they'd performed countless times before. But this cry changed everything. "Something's not right," Sarah's voice crackled through their communication system. At 58, she'd spent more time with whales than most people had spent at desk jobs. Her instincts were rarely wrong. "James, it's coming from the kelp forest to the east." The visibility was good that day, about 40 feet, but in these waters that meant they could see just far enough to get into trouble. As they navigated through the swaying kelp forest, James couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The usual playful seals that frequented these waters were nowhere to be seen, never a good sign. Then they saw her. Through the emerald-tinted water, a massive shape emerged, a female humpback whale, easily 40 feet long. But something was wrong with her movement. Instead of the graceful gliding that characterized these magnificent creatures, she was moving erratically, almost frantically. As they got closer, James's heart sank. This wasn't just any whale. This was Old Grace, a humpback they'd been tracking for over a decade, known for her distinctive scarring pattern near her dorsal fin. "My God," Sarah's voice trembled. "Look at her eyes." James had never seen such unmistakable fear in a whale's expression before. Old Grace's eye, nearly the size of a dinner plate, fixed upon them with an intelligence that seemed almost human. But what struck him most was the panic he saw there, the same panic he'd heard in her cry. The two divers approached cautiously, maintaining a respectful distance. Old Grace could easily crush them with a single movement, distressed as she was. But instead of showing aggression, she did something that made both divers question everything they knew about these creatures. She stopped moving and positioned herself to directly face them. "She's asking for help," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. "In all my years..." James switched on his underwater camera, knowing they needed to document whatever they were about to discover. As they carefully circled the massive creature, the source of her distress became apparent. A massive tangle of industrial fishing nets, ropes, and what appeared to be abandoned crab traps were wrapped around her tail flukes and trailing behind her for at least 30 feet. But it was worse than that. The netting was cutting into her flesh, leaving angry red welts where it had been slowly tightening with each movement. How long had she been swimming like this? Days? Weeks? The thought made James's stomach turn. "We need backup," James said, already reaching for his emergency beacon. "This is going to take a full team." But as he moved to signal the surface, Old Grace let out another cry. Softer this time, more plaintive. She moved closer to them, her massive body blocking their ascent path. Sarah placed a hand on James's arm. "Wait," she said. "Look at her breathing pattern. She's exhausted, James. She's been fighting this for too long. If we leave now..." She didn't need to finish the sentence. They both knew what happened to entangled whales who couldn't keep swimming. The weight of the debris would eventually drag them down, leading to a slow, terrible death. Old Grace had found them, her rescuers, and she wasn't about to let them leave. "The light's good for another 3 hours," James said, running calculations in his head. "We have enough air for 2 hours at this depth. Basic toolkit between us." He looked at Sarah, knowing she was thinking the same thing. Sarah nodded, already reaching for her cutting tools. "We've done this before. Never with one this big, but..." She patted her rescue knife. "We start with the worst parts first, free her flukes enough to keep her mobile. If we can't finish it all, at least she'll have a fighting chance until the backup team arrives." As they prepared to begin their rescue attempt, Old Grace remained surprisingly still, as if she understood their intentions. But there was something else in her eye now, beyond the fear, a glimmer of hope. James couldn't help but wonder how many boats she had approached before finding them. How many humans had passed her by without recognizing her desperate plea for help? As Sarah prepared to make the first cut, James switched his camera to video mode. Whether they succeeded or failed, the world needed to see this. They needed to understand that these magnificent creatures weren't just mindless giants of the deep. They were intelligent, emotional beings capable of recognizing when they needed help and brave enough to trust their ancient enemies to provide it. What happened next would challenge everything they thought they knew about whale behavior and test the limits of both human courage and cetacean trust. The first cut was always the hardest. Despite her years of experience, Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she approached the massive tangle of ropes wrapped around Old Grace's flukes. One wrong move, one startled reaction from the whale, and both divers could be seriously injured or worse. But as she positioned herself near the first thick rope, something extraordinary happened. Old Grace deliberately rolled to her side, lifting her tail slightly higher in the water, as if presenting the worst of the entanglement to Sarah. James, who was documenting everything with his camera, nearly dropped it in astonishment. In 2 decades of marine rescue, he'd never seen such deliberate cooperation from a whale. "She knows," Sarah's voice was thick with emotion as it came through the comm system. "She understands what we're trying to do." With renewed confidence, she began working on the first rope, a thick industrial fishing line that had cut deeply into the whale's flesh. The water around them was getting darker, not just from the approaching afternoon, but from small clouds of blood that appeared each time Sarah managed to free a section of rope. Old Grace flinched occasionally but remained remarkably still, only her rhythmic breathing causing gentle currents in the water around them. James kept the camera steady while maintaining watch. His years of experience had taught him that the ocean could change its mood in an instant. Already he could see curious blue sharks circling at the edge of their visibility, drawn by the small amounts of blood in the water. They weren't an immediate threat, but their presence added another layer of urgency to the situation. "Sarah," he warned, "we've got company." "I see them," she replied, not looking up from her work. She had managed to free one major section of rope, but what she found underneath made her curse. "James, this isn't just recent. There are layers here. Some of these lines have been on her for months." The revelation hit them both hard. Old Grace had been suffering silently during their previous encounters, gradually accumulating more debris until she finally reached the point where she could no longer cope alone. The thought of her struggling all this time, while they had been observing her without noticing her distress, was almost unbearable. As if sensing their dismay, Old Grace let out a soft, almost musical sound, different from her earlier cries of distress. It seemed almost reassuring. The vibrations pulsed through the water around them, and remarkably, the circling sharks retreated further into the gloom. Time became fluid as they worked, marked only by the steady hiss of their regulators and the occasional need to check their air gauges. Sarah methodically worked through the entanglement, while James documented everything and helped where he could, passing tools and holding sections of cut rope to prevent them from floating back into the mess. But it wasn't just about removing debris anymore. As they worked, they began to understand that they were participating in something unprecedented. Old Grace wasn't just passively accepting their help. She was actively facilitating it. When they needed to access a different area, she would slowly shift her position. When Sarah struggled with a particularly tough knot, the whale would adjust her angle to provide better access. "Look at this," James said, pointing his camera at a particularly nasty section of netting. Wrapped within the industrial mesh were plastic bags, pieces of broken fishing gear, and even a damaged crab pot, a tragic testament to the state of our oceans. Each piece they removed was like reading a chapter in Old Grace's struggle for survival. Their air supplies were beginning to run low when Sarah finally reached what appeared to be the oldest part of the entanglement, a thick rope that had been there so long it was partially embedded in the whale's flesh. This would be the most delicate and painful part of the rescue. "Old girl," Sarah spoke directly to the whale, knowing that while she might not understand the words, she would sense the meaning. "This is going to hurt, But it needs to come out. What happened next would be debated in marine biology circles for years to come. As Sarah prepared to work on the embedded rope, Old Grace began to emit a series of low-frequency vibrations. Not her usual vocalizations, but something deeper, more primal. The sounds seemed to ripple through the water around them, creating patterns in the sediment on the ocean floor below. James checked his air gauge again. 30 minutes left at most. They were about to face the most challenging part of the rescue, and their window of opportunity was closing fast. But as he looked into Old Grace's enormous eye, he saw something that made all their efforts worthwhile. A spark of intelligence that seemed to say, "I trust you." The sun had moved significantly across the sky above them, its rays now creating ethereal beams in the water. Time was running out, but they were about to attempt something that would either end in triumph or tragedy. The next few minutes would determine not just Old Grace's fate, but potentially change our understanding of these magnificent creatures forever. Sarah's hands were starting to cramp from the constant cutting and unwinding of rope, but she couldn't stop now. The embedded line was proving to be their greatest challenge yet. Years of salt water had essentially fused it with Old Grace's flesh, creating a horrific merger of marine life and human debris. "We need to do this methodically," James said, positioning himself to better light the area with his dive torch. "Cut small sections, give her time to adjust." His own air gauge was now showing less than 25 minutes of breathing time remaining, and the sun's rays were growing noticeably dimmer in the water around them. As Sarah began work on the embedded rope, Old Grace let out a sound unlike anything they'd heard before. Not quite a cry, not quite a song, but something in between. The vibrations rippled through the water with such intensity that both divers felt it in their bones. Yet remarkably, the whale remained still, accepting the pain as part of her path to freedom. "Come on, old girl," Sarah murmured through her regulator as she carefully separated the first few inches of rope from flesh. "Just a little longer." Blood clouded the water around them more heavily now, and James found himself constantly scanning the darkness beyond their immediate area, worried about the sharks they'd seen earlier. Suddenly, their comm system crackled to life with an unexpected voice. "Rescue 1, this is Surface. Please respond." The voice belonged to Miguel, their boat captain who had been maintaining radio silence to avoid disturbing their work. "Surface, this is Rescue 1, James replied, trying to keep his voice steady despite his growing concern about their air supply. "Go ahead." "Weather's turning fast up here." Miguel's voice was tight with worry. "Got a squall moving in from the northwest. You've got maybe 20 minutes before it hits. After that—" He left the sentence unfinished, but they all knew what it meant. Storm conditions would make their current position extremely dangerous, if not impossible to maintain. Sarah paused in her work, looking at James. They'd both been so focused on the rescue that they hadn't noticed the changing conditions above. Now that they were paying attention, they could feel it, the subtle but growing movement of the water around them, the first hints of the turbulence to come. Old Grace seemed to sense the change too. Her massive body shifted slightly, her eye rolling to look upward toward the surface. But instead of showing signs of panic, she appeared to become even calmer, more determined. It was as if she knew this might be her last chance at freedom. "We're not leaving her like this," Sarah said, her voice firm despite her exhaustion. She turned back to the embedded rope, working with renewed urgency. James nodded, adjusting his position to better support her efforts while keeping the camera steady. This was no longer just a rescue. It was a race against time, tide, and nature itself. The next few minutes were intense, marked by the steady snick of Sarah's cutting tools and the increasingly noticeable movement of the water around them. Old Grace continued to emit her strange pulsing sounds, which seemed to grow stronger and more complex. Other whales began to respond in the distance, their calls carrying through the water from somewhere beyond their visual range. Then, just as Sarah was working on the final section of embedded rope, something extraordinary happened. The water around them filled with whale song, not just from Old Grace, but from what sounded like an entire pod. The calls seemed to be coming from all directions, growing louder and more numerous by the second. "James," Sarah's voice was filled with wonder. "Look." Through the darkening water they could see them, massive shapes moving at the edge of visibility, Other humpbacks, at least 5 or 6 from what they could count, had arrived. They moved in a loose circle around Old Grace and the divers, their songs now reaching an almost deafening crescendo. They're supporting her, James realized, his voice thick with emotion. They're here for her. In all his years of whale research, he documented cases of humpbacks helping other marine mammals, even protecting them from predators. But this was different. This was organized, purposeful, almost like a community coming together to support one of their own in crisis. The arrival of the pod seemed to give Old Grace new strength. She remained remarkably still as Sarah worked on the final sections of rope, but her breathing had become stronger, more regular. The other whales maintained their circle, their songs creating a constant backdrop of support and encouragement. As the last few minutes of their air supply ticked away, and with the storm bearing down on them from above, Sarah and James found themselves at the center of something few humans had ever witnessed. A moment of pure connection between species, a bridge across the vast divide between our world and theirs. But would it be enough? Could they complete the rescue before nature forced them to abandon their efforts? The answer would come in the next few crucial minutes as storm clouds gathered above, and the ocean itself seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. The surface of the ocean had transformed from gentle swells to choppy waves, making the water around them increasingly turbulent. Through their diving masks, James and Sarah could see the sunlight above flickering and fragmenting as storm clouds gathered. Their air supplies were now critically low, 15 minutes at most, and they still hadn't completely freed Old Grace from her years-long entanglement. "Surface to rescue one," Miguel's voice crackled through their comms again, more urgent this time. "Storm's moving faster than predicted. You've got 10 minutes max before it hits full force. You need to start ascending soon?" Sarah's hands were bleeding inside her gloves from the constant work with the ropes, but she barely noticed the pain. She was focused entirely on the final section of embedded line, the worst part of the entire entanglement. Years of marine growth had turned it into something that seemed almost like scar tissue, a grotesque reminder of human impact on marine life. The surrounding pod of humpbacks had drawn closer, their massive bodies creating a living wall that somehow seemed to buffer some of the water's increasing turbulence. Their continued songs vibrated through the water with such intensity that James's camera picked up visible ripples in the clouded water around them. "Almost there," Sarah muttered, her breathing heavy as she worked the cutting tool beneath another section of rope. "Almost there, old girl." Old Grace remained remarkably still, but her eye fixed on Sarah showed signs of increasing distress. Whether from pain or awareness of the approaching storm, they couldn't tell. The other whales' songs had changed tenor, becoming more urgent, almost warning-like. James checked his air gauge again. 12 minutes left. "Sarah," he said reluctantly, "we're running out of time." Even as he spoke, a powerful current swept through, strong enough to push him back several feet before he could stabilize himself. That's when Old Grace did something that would challenge every scientific paper ever written about cetacean behavior. As Sarah struggled with the final embedded section, the massive whale slowly, deliberately began to roll onto her side. The movement was so careful, so precise, that it didn't disturb Sarah's position. Instead, it brought the remaining entanglement into a better position, while simultaneously using her enormous body to shield both divers from the strengthening current. "My God," James breathed, his camera trained on the scene. "Are you seeing this?" Sarah didn't respond verbally, but her movements became even more focused, more determined. The other whales tightened their circle, their bodies creating a barrier against the increasingly rough conditions. Through their songs, a new pattern emerged, shorter, more rhythmic, almost like a countdown. Thunder crackled above, audible even through 30 feet of water. The storm was nearly upon them. Miguel's voice came through again, tight with worry. 5 minutes. You need to start ascending." But they were so close. Sarah could see the end of the embedded rope now, could see where years of trauma were about to end. Just a few more cuts, a few more careful manipulations. Suddenly, a massive surge of current broke through the whale barrier, catching all of them off guard. James was thrown backward, barely managing to keep his camera directed at the scene. Sarah grabbed onto one of Old Grace's barnacles to steady herself, and the whale remained absolutely still, like a stone monument in a raging river, providing what anchor she could. That's when they heard it, a different sort of song from the surrounding whales, something that seemed to carry both warning and encouragement. Old Grace responded with a sound of her own, one that vibrated through Sarah's entire body. And in that moment, as thunder crashed above and currents swirled below, Sarah made her decision. She looked at her air gauge, 10 minutes, then at James and gave a single, firm nod. No words were needed. They had come this far. They would see it through. The lives of these remarkable creatures were worth whatever risk they were taking. James steadied himself and moved closer, using his dive light to illuminate Sarah's work area one final time. The storm was transforming the ocean around them, but within their small bubble of whale-protected space, something miraculous was about to happen. The question was, could they complete their task before the full fury of the storm forced them to abandon their efforts? And even if they succeeded, would they be able to make it safely to the surface through what was rapidly becoming a tempest? The answer would come in the next few minutes, as nature's fury collided with human determination and whale wisdom in a desperate race against time. The ocean seemed to hold its breath for one crucial moment as Sarah made the final cut. There was a sound, something between a snap and a tear, and suddenly the last piece of embedded rope pulled free. The release sent a small cloud of debris floating into the turbulent water, carrying with it years of old Grace's suffering. "It's done!" Sarah's voice cracked with emotion, even through the comm system. But they weren't safe yet. Their air supplies had dropped to critically low levels, and the storm above had reached full fury. The water around them churned with dangerous currents, held at bay only by the remarkable living barrier of whales that surrounded them. Old Grace's reaction to her final liberation was something neither diver would ever forget. The massive whale shuddered, her entire body trembling as if shaking off years of trauma. Then, slowly, deliberately, she moved her tail flukes, fully free for the first time in years. The movement sent small clouds of silt swirling up from the ocean floor. "We need to go," James said urgently, his eyes fixed on his air gauge. "Now." They had perhaps 5 minutes of air left, barely enough to make it to the surface under normal conditions, let alone in a storm. But before they could begin their ascent, Old Grace did something that would be discussed in marine biology conferences for decades to come. She lowered herself slightly in the water and tilted her body at an angle, creating a sort of living ramp with her massive form. The intention was unmistakable. "She wants us to hold on," Sarah realized, her voice filled with wonder. The other whales had begun to shift their positions too, forming a more protective circle around them. Their songs had changed again, becoming more structured, almost like a coordinated operation. They had no choice. Their original ascent line had been torn away by the storm, and the water was now so churned up that they could barely see 10 feet in any direction. Without help, they'd likely be swept away by the currents before they could reach the surface. James secured his camera and grabbed onto one of Old Grace's barnacles. Sarah did the same, and they exchanged one final look. Everything they'd known about whale behavior, about the boundaries between humans and marine mammals, was being rewritten in this moment. Old Grace began to rise, slowly and steadily, shielding them from the worst of the current with her massive body. The other whales moved with her, maintaining their protective formation. Through the churning water, James and Sarah could see bursts of lightning above, illuminating the surface like an angry strobe light. Their ascent seemed to take both forever and no time at all. Old Grace moved with incredible precision, adjusting her speed to allow them to equalize their pressure, somehow knowing the limitations of human physiology. The other whales continued their songs, which now seemed to pulse in time with the thunder above. When they finally broke the surface, it was into a scene of chaos. Waves crashed around them, rain lashed at their faces, and Miguel's boat was barely visible through the storm, its searchlight cutting through the darkness like a beacon. But Old Grace's massive body provided them with a lee, a small area of relative calm in the midst of the tempest. "There!" Miguel's voice carried across the water, and moments later the rescue boat was alongside them. As James and Sarah were pulled aboard, exhausted and overwhelmed, Old Grace remained nearby, her presence steady and reassuring until they were safely on deck. What happened next would be captured by Miguel's phone camera, creating footage that would eventually be seen by millions. Old Grace rose slightly higher in the water, her massive head clearing the surface. For a brief moment, her eye, now clear and bright, free of the pain and fear they'd seen earlier, met Sarah's gaze. Then, in a display that brought tears to everyone's eyes, she lifted her tail flukes high into the storm-dark sky, completely free of rope and debris, and brought them down in a massive splash that seemed more celebration than mere movement. The other whales joined her, breaching and splashing in what could only be described as a celebration. Even through the storm's fury, their joy was palpable, their songs carrying clearly across the water. Old Grace made one final pass by the boat, so close they could see the new scars that would forever tell her story of survival and rescue. Then, with a final lift of her flukes, she joined her pod, disappearing into the depths. In the months that followed, the story of Old Grace would spread far beyond the confines of the marine biology community. The footage James captured would be viewed millions of times, sparking new discussions about marine mammal intelligence and the impact of ocean debris. But more importantly, it would touch hearts around the world, reminding people that in the vast blue expanse of our oceans, extraordinary bonds can form between species, bonds strong enough to withstand any storm. Sarah and James would see Old Grace many times in the years that followed, always free of entanglements, often accompanied by her pod. And each time, she would approach their boat, roll gently to her side, and lift her flukes in what they came to think of as a greeting between old friends. Her scars remained, but they were no longer a mark of suffering. Instead, they had become a testament to the day when human compassion and whale wisdom combined to create a miracle in the middle of a storm. The end of Old Grace's entanglement marked the beginning of something far greater, a deeper understanding of our connection to the magnificent creatures with whom we share our blue planet, and a renewed commitment to protecting their world and ours for generations to come.